supposed to make sure this is on. I'm assuming it's on. There it is. It's on. Make sure this is on. It's on. Okay. Would you close that door to the kitchen? I don't care about the hallway, but the kitchen. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant that we may so hear, read, mark, and inwardly digest them, and hold fast to the blessed hope of everlasting life through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Amen. Okay, first a disclaimer. I lied last week. I am not going to cover John. I'm going to just cover Matthew, hopefully Matthew and Luke this morning, their passion narratives. John, well, there's the Synoptic Gospels and then there's John, and it's so different. And in some ways, we can actually talk about that when we talk about the resurrection in John, because those two, the crucifixion, passion narratives, and the resurrection are very connected, as they are in all the Gospels in some ways, but more so in John than in others. The second thing I want to say is that I want you to remember that we're looking at each of the Gospels as if it were the only Gospel you ever possessed and what it would tell you about these different things. And so in some ways I will be comparing them to the other Gospels to show the uniqueness of that particular Gospel. And hopefully I can get through all my notes. Victor and Erwin have vetted this. And so it's not too bad, actually. You know, I got a C+, so that's average. So, beginning with the Gospel of Matthew, I'm going to use the same thing that I did last week. Raymond Brown's idea that the passion narrative from the garden to the grave is done in 4 acts. Now, in Matthew, it's important that you understand when you come to the passion narrative that you remember the overall context, because this is not just a separate story, but rather a context. Matthew opens with Herod the king, the chief priests, and the scribes seeking to put to death the child of Jesus. Matthew closes with Pilate, the emperor's representative, the chief priests, and the scribes seeking to put Jesus to death. It's interesting to note that the only 2 places in the Gospel of Matthew where Jesus is called King of the Jews is in his birth and at his death. It's important to notice that the infancy narrative and the passion narrative have a kind of 5-fold pattern of scenes, alternating between those who support Jesus and those who are against him. In the beginning, it's Mary, Joseph, the Magi. In the end, it's Joseph of Arimathea, Mary Magdalene, and the women and disciples. Those who are opposed to him in the beginning are Herod, chief priests, and scribes. Those at the end are chief priests, scribes, and guards. Deeper meaning comes from remembering the roles of those who appear in the Passion and what they have meant throughout the entire story. The Matthean disciples have clearly confessed that Jesus is the Son of God. And so their failure and flight at the end of the gospel in the garden is all the more shocking. The Matthean Peter was pulled from the sea by Jesus, confessed him as Christ, the Son of the living God. So his denial of Jesus is all that more poignant. Jesus is the most critical of the Pharisees in Matthew, yet he mentions these adversaries only once during the Passion narrative, supporting the other Gospels' assertions that it was the Sadducees, not the Pharisees, who were the principal agents in the death of Jesus. The Gentile Magi acknowledged Jesus at his birth. In the Passion narrative, it is the Gentile Pilate's wife who receives a revelatory dream, like the star, that says Jesus is more than this. The statement, his blood is on us and our children by the chief priest, is more reminiscent of the parable of the vineyard workers who put to death the son of the owner when he comes in chapter 21. That's kind of the overall context. I want to look at Matthew in particular. In Matthew, the disciples sing the final hymn of the Passover liturgy as they travel to the Mount of Olives. The Mount is important in Matthew as it is mentioned twice in the Old Testament, once in Zechariah and second in Samuel. It is on this very site that God will come from heaven to judge the world. More importantly, it is the place that David flees when his life is threatened by Absalom. And it is here that he discovers his most trusted advisor has betrayed him. It is on the Mount of Olives in Matthew where the disciples desert him, Peter denies him, and Judas performs the treasonous act of betrayal. In other words, the story on the Mount of Disciples is echoing the story of David. It's incredibly symbolic. It's an incredibly symbolic place for this to happen. In the garden, Jesus' relationship with the disciples comes to its finale. Leaving the disciples and taking the three chosen one, he falls on his face like Psalm 42, and his soul is sorrowful. According to Hebrews, Jesus offered prayers and supplications with tears and loud cries to God. The content of the prayer is interesting because it's filled with words, images, and petitions that remind us of Jesus' teaching. This may be a way of Matthew's affirming that Jesus' relationship with the Father is consistent throughout life and death, which is very different than the portrayal we have in Mark. 3 times Jesus withdraws and prays. 3 times he returns to find the disciples sleeping, attesting to Matthew's use of a literary pattern of 3 to create a well-balanced and effective story. There's always 3s, and we'll play with that a little bit more. The disciples sleeping is a symbol of their spiritual state. Unlike Mark, Matthew's Jesus arises from his prayer with a resoluteness that he says, "Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is hand." The fact that Judas is identified as one of the 12 gives credence to the theory that the Passion narrative was an independent story before it was attached to each of the Gospels. Because if you're just hearing the story, you don't know who Judas is. So you have to be told that Judas is one of the 12. We need to know who the players are. But in Matthew, it serves another purpose. Judas has already been mentioned twice earlier. Therefore, it seems to make the point of the hideousness of his betrayal because he is one of Jesus' most trusted advisors. Think of the David story. We know that because Judas held the money. Only the most trusted hold the money. That wouldn't occur at this day, but anyway. The intimacy is more further stressed in Matthew because Jesus addresses Judas as friend. It's only found in Matthew. It's the only place that Judas is called friend by Jesus. It is in Matthew alone that Jesus says to the armed resistance, "Put away your sword. Those who live by the sword will die by the sword." Which raises the question, were there even swords present, and why were they present? Why do anybody have swords in Jesus' company? More troubling is Matthew's move from Mark's bystander to the identification that the person wielding the sword in Matthew is Peter, one of Jesus' trusted disciples. Matthew wants everyone to know that Jesus didn't command the action. Even more troubling, though, is how Jesus has been able to elude capture in the past, and yet he fails to do so now. The answer is that Jesus is allowing himself these indignities so that, quote, the prophetic scriptures may be fulfilled. Now, Act 2, the Sanhedrin trial, Peter's denial, and Judas's desperation. Matthew is the only gospel who identifies Caiaphas as the high priest. No matter the Passion narrative is controversial about this Sanhedrin trial in the middle of the night, no matter whether you consider it as actually having happened or not, is it not essential to the gospel writers, because their point is to prove that Jesus is innocent of all charges, especially the charge of blasphemy, because his words and his intent have been distorted. He's been taken out of context. There's an irony in the fact that the readers of the gospel in the mid-80s, when the gospel was probably being put together, already knew that the temple had been destroyed. The destruction of the temple is seen as retribution. Matthew's intent was to encourage his readers who had suffered under synagogue leaders to remember that they had treated their Savior with the same hostility, and look what happened to them. Again, as in Mark, Jesus is interrogated by the Jewish court. While Jesus is being interrogated by the Jewish court, Peter is being interrogated in the courtyard by maids and bystanders. Again, a threefold pattern. As Peter tries to avoid the question, I don't know what you mean. I don't know who you're talking about. Then he lies. I don't know the man. As in Mark, Jesus proves a prophet as the Sanhedrin is condemning him as a false prophet. They're saying, you're a false prophet, and yet his prophecy about Peter denying him 3 times is happening at the very moment they say you're false. Matthew stops at this point to dramatize the previous words of Jesus. Woe to the many by whom the Son of Man is betrayed, by reintroducing the character of Judas. As they're escorting Jesus to Pilate, they're at the same time trying to decide what to do with the blood money that Judas threw upon the floor. In having the Jewish leaders decide to buy a field for Judas, who hung himself the same way that David's trusted advisor hung himself, Matthew creates a problem. How does one reconcile this detail with Acts, where Judas buys the field and later dies from an internal combustion similar to that of the Greek emperor in Maccabees? There's obviously some early Christian tradition behind Judas's death and the field, but we never know what it really is. Matthew is using the Passion tradition to make his own theological point. Judas's betrayal and his blood money match the prophecies of Zechariah and Jeremiah. Matthew has created a triptych with Jesus in the center, Peter's denial on one side, and Judas's desperation on the other. Matthew further uses the different actions as a symbol of the choices one has for Jesus. After Peter denies him, he goes out and weeps bitterly. Judas goes out and hangs himself. Act 3, the Roman trial. Jesus finds himself deserted and alone before a governor who can decide his ultimate fate, but he remains silent, which frustrates the governor and puts him on the defensive. Again, we have the introduction of the custom to release a prisoner at Passover. This practice has been debated, even though it appears in all 4 Gospels, because there's no other evidence of that tradition having ever existed in any of the Roman records or any of the Jewish records of the ancient writers. So, whether it happened or not, but Matthew's presentation is made even more troubling by his interruption once again to insert Pilate's wife's dream. It's a dramatic, marvelous device. Here's a Gentile woman, unknown to Jesus, unknowing about Jesus, who has a dream, a revelation that recognizes that Jesus is innocent and seeks to release at the same time Jesus, and at the same time, the Jewish leaders are working through the crowd to have the guilty man, Barnabas, released. He keeps these options always open. Even more intriguing is that some of the most important manuscripts having asked, Pilate asking, do you want me to release Jesus Barabbas or Jesus called the Christ? The name Barabbas means son of father, which creates the irony that Pilate is faced with two men charged with a crime, both named Jesus, one who is named the Son of God and the other who's named the Son of Man, Son of the Father. So do I release the Son of the Father or do I release the Son of the God? Which one do I release? Nevertheless, Matthew presents us with an irony that a guilty is being acclaimed innocent and an innocent man is being acclaimed guilty. Even more dramatic is that the Gentile governor recognizes Jesus' innocence, so he publicly washes his hands of the whole thing. Then comes the line that has caused more pain and more suffering in the world than almost any other. His blood is on us and our children. It's an allusion to the Old Testament, describing those who are responsible for death. The washing of the hands in the Old Testament signifies innocence in reference to a murder. So, throughout history, that has been pointed to as the reason why we need to persecute the Jews, because Jesus' blood is on them, and that's not true. That's not why Matthew has it said. It goes more back to the parable. It's more symbolic than that. It's not about real people. Somebody's got a question here, I know. Yes?
If Jesus is supposed to be innocent here, then why, and I'm looking when the high priest says, tell us if you are the Christ, Son of God. Yes, it is as you say, Jesus replied, and that he has spoken blasphemy.
Right.
So if that is blasphemy there, then why is later they say that it wasn't blasphemy and that he's innocent?
Because we all know that Jesus really is the Son of God. He's not telling the lie. He's not blaspheming. He's telling the truth.
But the Jews said it was blasphemy.
Right, but the Jews claimed him a blasphemy. It's like being claimed a false prophet when in actuality the prophecy he's proclaimed has come true.
But then Pilate says he's not.
Right. Pilate doesn't care about whether he's God, the Son of God or not. Pilate's more worried about treason at this point, about a civil crime, about going against the state. Pilate doesn't give anything about religious ideas. I was trying to think of the right word. Yeah, well, I was working on it. Okay. Yeah, I'm a little more earthy.
Are the Jews symbolic or anyone who rejected Jesus?
Yeah, the Jews are symbolic throughout, I believe, the Jews are symbolic throughout all four Gospels, especially in John, but in Matthew as well, of those who do not take Jesus seriously. It is not the Jews, but it's anybody who is not a believer in Jesus. That would be my interpretation.
Readers at that time would understand that.
Yes, they would have. They would have seen it much differently. Trying to think of a modern example. Help me out here, guys.
Kevin, you might point out, we might point
Well.
out, that Matthew, the writer of this gospel, was a Jew.
Right.
He was a Jewish Christian. He was writing from within and for a Jewish Christian community that have been forced out and alienated from the larger Jewish community. So that there's a historical issue at the time of the writing of Matthew that pits the Jesus-believing Jews over against the
Non-believing Jews. Right. Right.
Ignorance on this, but did the Germans, and you mentioned this last week, and I thought about, did the Germans use that when they were exterminating the Jews? I didn't never really
Yeah.
think about it in that way.
Yes.
I thought it would be
Yes. It goes all the way back to, Augustine, Calvin, Martin Luther, all of them that all of them said the Jews are responsible. And Luther is Martin Luther is a Lutheran, German, most of the Germans. So yeah, they use that very much. So.
But they don't like to distinguish between the Jews that were with Jesus and the Jews that weren't.
No.
So not all Jews.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of again, I because you're talking about a different time, different place, you got to remember that Jews are a symbol. And they would have gotten it in hearing this. We know who we're talking about. I guess the best example I can say in the modern world is between Anglicans and Episcopalians. We all know that real Episcopalians still are in the Episcopal Church of the United States, while there's that other group of Anglicans that have broken away. And yet yet at times we refer to ourselves all as Anglicans. But we all know who the Anglicans really are.
But we don't go shooting each other.
Well, pardon?
We don't shoot each other.
Not yet. But it'll get there. Metaphorically we have.
Kevin, in the courthouse, there is shooting going on.
Yeah, exactly, in the courthouse.
Anglicans and Episcopalians.
Yeah, between the Anglicans and Episcopalians, we've only spent like $6 million on court cases, so we haven't shot anything yet, but. Okay, Act 4, final act, crucifixion, death, and burial. Jesus' journey to Golgotha is told in Matthew with unbelievable and a kind of disconcerting brevity. Matthew follows Mark closely. Incidents at the place of execution are told with no emotion, no pathos, and very little comment. The unique element in Matthew's story of the crucifixion is there is a constant Old Testament allusion. It is only in Matthew that Jesus is offered wine mixed with gall, which is a direct reference to Psalm 69. Once more, the threefold pattern unfolds as there are three groups which parade by the cross in derision of Jesus. Again, the very words of the mockery by the three different groups are patterned after the words of the psalm, especially Psalm 22. In Matthew, Jesus speaks only once from the cross. His final words are, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. In Mark, it's Eloi, Eloi. Matthew's is more Semitic, and it's much more, the first verse of Psalm 22 is more Hebraized than Mark's, which makes it more intelligible by the bystanders, those standing around hearing Elijah. Eloi, Eloi is a little tough to get Elijah out of. Eli, Eli, that could, once again, the gospel writer does not hesitate to make Jesus' words and suffering real. His sense of abandonment on the cross is palpable, and the despair agonizing. At this moment, Jesus is very, very, very human. However, in Mark's gospel, we see God's abandonment of Jesus. In Matthew's view, God does not abandon Jesus, because what happens immediately upon his death, not only is the veil torn in two, but there's also an earthquake. And the rocks split open, and the tombs open up, and the seas rise, and everyone sees dead people running around. It's interesting. It's very similar to Josephus's description of the destruction of the temple by Titus. The same events happen. There are certainly Old Testament apocalyptic passages that reinforce this. Matthew did not hesitate to have a star mark Jesus' birth. So why should it be a surprise that he would have supernatural events marking Jesus' death? All of these events lead the Gentiles to confess that Jesus is truly the Son of God, just as it led the Magi to confess that Jesus was King of the world. What follows is almost anticlimactic. Like Mark, women are looking on from a distance, but unaffected by all these phenomena. The tradition of Joseph of Arimathea, common to all four Gospels, is the most embellished in Matthew. Joseph is a rich man, which means that a rich saint is not to be despised by the community. I like that. Okay? According to Matthew, Joseph was a disciple and Jesus is buried in his tomb. These details are absent from Mark and only cloud the issue. If the disciples buried Jesus, why didn't the women participate? Is this included in the fulfillment of the commandment in Deuteronomy, which stipulates that a criminal's body should not hang overnight? Did he later become a disciple, so it's read back into the story? Peculiar to Matthew is that the chief priests and Pharisees get permission from Pilate to post guards at the tomb. For Matthew, the presence of the guards confirms the resurrection, since now natural causes cannot be used to explain why the tomb is empty. They're asked to post the guards so that Jesus won't steal, body won't be stolen. The only reason you would say that is because people would have been saying Jesus' body was stolen. So you got to remember, you're writing to a group of people who you're trying to defeat these. Most scholars doubt the historicity of the guards at the tomb. The disciples showed no expectation that they thought Jesus would be resurrected. So why would the Jewish authorities have any idea that Jesus might be resurrected? He's dead. We got rid of the problem. We buried him. Therefore, we don't have to worry about anything. So why would you post guards? You wouldn't. None of the other Gospels accounts demonstrate any idea that the women were coming to the tomb on Easter morning were going to face guards. A more likely scenario is that Matthew includes a scene because he says the Jewish authorities told the soldiers to lie, which is believed until this day. By having the guards placed at the tomb, Matthew wants to illustrate God's power with regard to Jesus. You mock him, you kill him, you torture him, you bury him, you even seal up the tomb with guards. But Jesus shakes the whole earth upon his resurrection and now sits at the right hand of God in power and glory. And if you put it in those terms, it's pretty dramatic. So the tomb becomes that. Okay. Questions about...
I've always wondered if indeed those supernatural things happened where the curtain was rent and tombs are being, why wouldn't that have been written about in Jewish history or something at the same time that you'd say, I mean, it would seem like it would be so miraculous and also happening in the city.
Well, see, God caused an earthquake yesterday in Los Angeles, and you just thought it was just a tectonic plate shifting. Oh, yeah, actually, that was God visiting retribution on LA for whatever they did. And we could believe that. I mean, if you go that way, then you go, Hurricane Katrina hits New Orleans because it's New Orleans. So the chances of, in reality, I don't believe that there were earthquakes. I think that Matthew is so much setting up this dramatic scene, and Jesus has been killed and tortured and mocked, and all of those things, and the whole world is splitting open as a result of his resurrection. So there's a symbolic character to that part. Okay.
Okay, so back to Matthew's sort of axe to grind
Yes.
against the Jewish establishment.
Right.
And then even though the execution of Jesus was a political crime for sedition,
Right.
he is nevertheless absolving them, the Romans, and casting aspersions on the Jewish establishment thoughtfully and purposefully.
Yeah, he's casting it on those Jews who can't see the truth. What he wants to be able to show is a twofold thing. In the Roman Empire, we want to show that Jesus was innocent of sedition. He's innocent of treason. Therefore, we got to have the Romans realizing that he's innocent. Now we have to understand that the Jews, those people who are part of the law of Moses, the tradition, who are part of Jesus' family, didn't quite get it. Others did. And we want you to see, those people who just don't get it. Now I'm going to go from preaching to meddling because, or teaching to meddling in the sense that, we've been doing some work in mission and outreach about toxic charity and about how when helping hurts other people. And there's this illusion. The best question we come up with is, what is poverty? What is poverty? If you ask a North American what is poverty, they will tell you it's about lacking something. Food, water, shelter, clothes, those kinds of things. If you ask the rest of the world, poverty is not about lacking things. It's about not having respect and hope and community. So who's really poor? Those of us who live in isolated communities with fenced walls and make sure we're protected at all, quote unquote, protected and isolated. What's the greatest complaint in North America? We are alone. Or those who live in, quote unquote, third world countries who have tremendous community and relationships but don't have anything else. So you've got that. So which is it and who doesn't get it? That doesn't mean that neither side doesn't hear the other side and we need to come together. But when you define it like that, and that's, for me, that seems to be similar to what was being done by Matthew and the Jews.
Well, Alan Jones is good. Passion for Pilgrimage.
Yeah.
He really is about Lent, talks about having to have a common language. I mean, there are three things that you need for repentance and so forth, and one very important thing is common language. But when the movie was made about Jesus across a few years ago, I never saw it.
The Passion of Narrative by Mel Gibson.
The Jewish people just went ballistic because they felt the movie was pointing them out, and in particular for Jesus.
Yeah.
As a whole, they were not
Yeah.
happy.
And I said in the very beginning of my first lecture, we cannot discount the fact that there is some anti-Semitism, there's some anti-Jewish thought in the Gospels. But that's, and I think we have to acknowledge that it's there and it has been used by us, by Christians. And so the Jews are more sensitive to it than others. It's kind of like if you've had a death or an illness or something else that's happened to you, you're more sensitive to that. How come it is that you never see the car you just bought until you buy it and you're driving, and then everybody seems to be driving that same car? It's amazing how that happens. But so we have to, the Jews are more sensitive to that, and we need to pay attention to that and take honestly and say, yes, there is anti-Semitism. There is some little bit of Jew, but that is not what the story was about. It's not. Does it really matter who killed Jesus? Because Jesus offered, according to the Gospels, according to what I think is theology, Jesus offers himself rather than is put upon. He willingly does this. He steps into the fray rather than being forced into the fray.
Because it was written, that's what he had to do.
Well, that's how we read it back through the Old Testament, is that he had to do that. I think I'm on safe ground there.
Kenny, there's one little thing about the Jews. I think that it's easy to quote something in religious terms, but I think it's also important to point out that neither in Judaism nor in Islam is anyone permitted to charge interest
Right.
on money if you loan money. Well, not in Judaism you can't. In Christianity and Islam you were not supposed to do it. So the people would go to the Jews to get money, but by the same token, that was the only source of getting money, but they were being charged for it, and so then they resented that.
Yeah, there's a whole lot of...
Throughout history, but
Well, we can find. Here's a difference. In World War II, everybody called them Japs. If you dehumanize somebody and if you make them a characterization, a stereotype, it's much easier to persecute the poor, the orphans, the Japs, the Krauts, the ragheads. If you take, okay, who is that? It's nobody. It's nothing. It goes back to the 60s, if you remember, racism, and people would say, all those black people are bad except the ones I know. People said that. My dad said that, because once you get to know a person, you rarely characterize them in a generalized stereotype that takes away all their humanity. So all poor people, all homeless people are, drug addicts and criminals and mentally disturbed. I challenge you to go down to the gathering and find out who they really are. Because that's not all the story. That is some of the story. It's really nice when you can make certainties and absolutes, but the reality is nobody's all bad, nobody's all good. There's no absolutely and there's no certainty in life. And the worst thing you can do in religion is make it a certainty. Because when you make religion a certainty, an absolute, then you're willing to kill for it. When you realize that it's not as cut and dry, black and white as we would like it to be. So,
Did Judas betray Jesus? I mean, did he have a plan? He was going to betray him so Jesus could prove that he was king of the world?
Yeah, that's Cousin Zonkis' theory in The Last Temptation of Christ. And it's a theory that I don't think is substantiated by the Gospels. All we can say, I think the minimum that you can say is that Jesus was betrayed by one of his inner circle, according to the story. Don't know why. Anytime you try to put a motivation into what's going on into somebody's mind, you're basically reading yourself into theirs. I mean, when you start psychologizing people, then you start, I know why they're doing that. It's usually more about why you would do that than it is about why they would do that. So I think that's important.
Kevin, Nancy are watching a show called The Story of the Jews on PBS. Have you watched that? I think we heard it last night. The narrator reports on a man who was the bishop of Antioch. His name was John. The Jews called him Goatface, I believe was the term. And according to the narrator, he was the first one who really got the ball rolling with anti-Semitism. Now, I heard this over 12 hours ago, so maybe. Have you ever heard that or heard of that bishop or anybody?
I don't know that. Do you guys know that story? I don't. I've never heard that story.
Well, I may have heard it.
What I think I think it's in the early church, period.
You mentioned the controversial trial at night.
Right.
Why is that in there when the Jewish audience presumably would have said, wait a minute, this never would have happened?
Right, exactly. It's more, I believe the trial at night is a literary device to emphasize once again Jesus, that this was a trumped up charges, that this is a kangaroo court, that this, they broke every rule in order to get this done. Because Luke doesn't have the trial happening at night. It happens in the morning. So you've got, okay, that makes more sense historically. But, who knows, that would be to say that there's never been a rush trial in this country ever. Yeah, we can go through all those kinds of things. Okay, I got like 5 minutes to cover Luke. There's a couple of things that are significant about Luke. He is the gospel, of the three synoptic gospels, he's the one that differs most from Matthew and Mark. That leads some to believe that Luke had access to another passion narrative tradition that was separate from Mark and Matthew's. Matthew takes Mark almost verbatim and then inserts things in. Luke's narrative is in some ways completely different, and theological and factual more some ways closer to John than it is to Matthew and Luke. And yet he has all of those things, all those elements in there. He's more like the synoptics. The other thing is that you got to remember that Luke is a part of Luke Acts. It's a 2-volume set. And the crucifixion comes in the middle of the book. So you're not going to get everything resolved. It's the turning point of the book, but it's not the conclusion of the book like it is in Matthew and Luke, or Matthew and Mark. So you've got to remember to put those two together. Jesus, who is accused by Pilate, before Pilate by the chief priest as perverting the nation, is the same Jesus who, according to Luke, is born in total fidelity to the law of Moses, who's offered up on the 8th day for circumcision. Everything happens the way it is. The Jesus who's accused of withholding tribute to Caesar is the same Jesus who recently in Mark said, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, render unto God what is God's." Luke is trying to demonstrate by the various persons in the Passion drama that Jesus is innocent. If there's one thing you need to take away from all the Passion narratives, it is this: Jesus is innocent. Whatever they accused him of, whatever they charged him with, he's innocent. He is put to death as an innocent victim in some ways. But he's not a victim because he chooses to do it. But he's innocent, and he dies. I think there are 3 points really that you need to know. Jesus is innocent. Jesus is crucified as a criminal, and that's important. He is murdered. He is crucified as a criminal, and he's dead. He's dead. He's dead. There is no immortal soul that goes on. There is no part of him that lives. When they put Jesus in that tomb, he's dead, and there will never be another like him ever again. There's no part of him that goes on. There is nothing left but dust. There's no immortality of the soul. There's none of that. He's dead. When I was the rector on Good Friday, I would, at the end of the service, it would go totally black, and I would say, the darkness that surrounds you is the darkness of the tomb. The coldness that surrounds you is the coldness of the stone. Go home and weep, for tonight you have no God to pray to. Your God is dead. And until you can get that in your gut, until you get, that's what the stories are all about, getting that into your heart and your soul and your gut, then the words, "Alleluia, Christ is risen," are meaningless. They're meaningless. Because it means you have to go through this passion, the suffering of an innocent man, and he's dead. Then it makes it even harder to say, "Alleluia, Christ is risen," because you're like, oh my gosh, what kind of craziness is that?
How much of that is theology and how much of it is history?
History. I don't know that you can make any distinction. On a personal note, I don't believe that you can ever there is no such thing as history without some kind of philosophy or theology undergirding it. Just by the simple fact of what you choose to tell and how you tell it, you're telling it from a perspective. So I don't think there's any act that you can say, oh, you can describe what happened, but the minute you say that this led to, or this means, or da 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 da. That's a perspective. Because I can say, like with the miracles, oh gosh. With the miracles, you can say that they never happened, or you can say that they happened. But once you say one of those, you've stepped into a metaphysics or a outward eye. The different gospels. Each gospel has a different resurrection. So, thank you all. Go in peace. I gotta go. I'm supposed to start the service.
I just wanted to check with you. I kind of thought you did. Well, I wanted to hear it. There was a difference. Kathy and I are going it's okay to put them in there.
Yeah, she's big for her age, and she's ready to go. But, and she's got about 1 year. Yeah. This one came, you just need to read her. Hello, dear. I've seen you. About 6 months old. So her family, her brother, first, 7. 2 girls. Yeah, but they're older now when they were younger, and then because she's developmentally challenged, to try and keep more older kids. Easter cards for the kids. So we're putting the kids and their bios and stuff about this is the whole process. But we're putting individual ones on tables, so if you could have a particular prayer friend, you can go to that table, get an update on their bio, and a picture, and then do a card for them, an Easter card. But this is the whole concept of the current. I'm just telling them that a couple of kids are going to the youth house, which is off campus when they get to be about 15 or 16. They're emotionally ready to go. They go to the youth house.
Oh my goodness, so we can stick and wait and really get going.
This is Douglas, and she's now in both of these girls are
Just one out.
and they're both just on well, they're now they're going to college. Yeah, that was, we have a large percentage, and that's the whole idea is we follow them all. There's been we follow them all the
Yes, that's what I'm saying. The activities were great. The beginning might have. And you did your community too. Yes, ladies, well, let's go. Oh, that's great. That's Freddie right there.
One game is
Get to work.
Oh, yeah, you can do some second dressing.